"They're all dead because of me," she confessed. But the priest already knew about the poison in the communion wine. The sun came up slow over Redemption Creek that Sunday morning, painting the desert hills the color of old blood. Clara Santos stood at her kitchen window, watching the light creep across the dusty main street, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. They'd been shaking since before dawn, when she'd slipped through the back door of the little white church and done the thing that would kill them all. The communion wine sat in its silver cup on the altar now, waiting for lips that trusted God and trusted her, waiting for mouths that had spoken her name with kindness for all 17 years of her life. The poison she'd stirred into that holy wine was already settling, invisible as sin, quiet as death. Through the thin walls of her adobe house, Clara could hear her neighbors getting ready for worship. The Morales family next door. She could hear Maria singing softly as she braided her little daughter's hair. The same song she'd sung when Clara was small and scared. The same gentle voice that had soothed away nightmares after Clara's mother died, giving birth to her baby brother Santos. Santos. Her throat closed around his name like a fist. 7 years old and sleeping in the back room, his small chest rising and falling with the trust of a child who believed his sister would keep him safe. The outlaws who'd come the night had made it simple. Poison the communion wine, or watch Santos die screaming. They'd held a knife to his throat as they spoke, their faces hidden behind dirty bandanas, their eyes cold as winter stars. "Choose," the leader had whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "Save one, or watch us kill him slow." She'd chosen. God help her, she'd chosen. Now she watched Mrs. Henderson across the street step onto her porch in her best blue dress, the one she'd sewn by hand through long winter evenings. The old woman moved carefully, her back bent from 40 years of washing other people's clothes, but her face was bright with the joy of Sunday morning. She waved when she saw Clara at the window, and Clara lifted her hand to wave back, her fingers trembling like leaves in a storm. The church bell began to ring, deep, bronze notes that rolled across the valley like thunder. Father Miguel would be pulling the rope with his strong, calloused hands, the same hands that had baptized Clara in the creek when she was 8, the same hands that had held her when she wept over her mother's grave. Children's laughter floated on the morning air. The Parker boys were racing their wooden horses through the dust, their Sunday pants already dirty at the knees. Their mother would scold them gently and brush them clean with her apron, like she had every Sunday for the past 5 years. Little Mary Parker, only 4 years old, was trying to keep up with her brothers, her yellow ribbon coming loose from her hair. Clara pressed her forehead against the glass and closed her eyes. Behind her lids, she could see them all as they would be in an hour. Mrs. Henderson crumpled in her pew, her blue dress spread around her like spilled sky. The Parker boys still and silent, their wooden horses forgotten in the dust. Father Miguel fallen at his altar, the silver cup rolling empty from his fingers. All because of her. The front door of the church opened, and Father Miguel stepped into the morning light. Even from her window, Clara could see the way he moved, slow and careful, like a man who carried the weight of other people's sorrows in his bones. He wore his black robes and his silver cross, the one that caught the light when he lifted his arms to bless the congregation. His gray hair was combed back neat, and his face held that quiet peace that came to him during prayer. He looked directly at her window then, as if he could feel her watching. For a moment that lasted forever, their eyes met across the dusty street. Clara saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Not accusation, not anger, but a sadness so deep it seemed to reach all the way down to his soul. As if he already knew, as if he had always known. Then he turned and walked back into the church, and Clara was alone with her choice. More families were emerging now, dressed in their Sunday best and walking toward the white building that sat at the heart of their small town. The Gonzalez family with their twin babies, only 6 months old and wrapped in blankets their grandmother had knitted. Old Mr. Chin, who ran the general store, walking arm in arm with his wife of 50 years. The Rodriguez children, all 6 of them in a line like stepping stones, their hair slicked down with water and hope. They trusted her. All of them trusted her because she was Clara Santos, the girl who helped Mrs. Henderson with her washing, who taught the younger children their letters after school, who sang in the church choir with a voice clear as mountain water. They trusted her because she was one of them, born in this place, raised in this dust, shaped by these same endless skies. And she was about to betray every one of them. Santos stirred in the back room, and Clara heard the soft sound of his bare feet hitting the floor. Soon he would come padding out in his nightshirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes and asking for breakfast. Soon she would have to look at his face and know what she had chosen to save it. The church bell stopped ringing, leaving only the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees and the distant cry of a hawk riding the morning thermals. In that sudden quiet, Clara could hear her own heart beating against her ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape. She thought of her mother then, buried in the little cemetery behind the church where wild roses grew in summer. What would she think of this choice? What words would she have for a daughter who chose love over honor, family over community, one life over many? Clara. Santos's voice came soft from the doorway, sleepy and trusting. Why aren't you getting ready for church? She turned from a window and looked at him, hair sticking up in all directions, eyes still heavy with dreams, the scar on his chin from when he'd fallen from the apple tree last spring. 7 years old and beautiful in the way children are beautiful without knowing or trying. 7 years old and alive because of what she had done. We're not going today, she said, and her voice sounded strange and distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. Santos frowned, confused. They never missed church. Never in all his short life had Sunday come without the walk down the dusty street, without the familiar wooden pew, without the sound of voices raised in him. Are you sick? He asked, taking a step closer. Clara looked at him and felt her heart break clean in two. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I think I am. Outside, the last of the families were disappearing into the church. Soon Father Miguel would begin the service with his gentle words about love and forgiveness. Soon he would lift the silver cup and speak the ancient words that turned wine into something sacred. Soon they would all drink, one by one, trusting in God and in each other and in the bonds that held their small community together. And Clara would wait here in the growing heat of the day, holding her brother close and listening for the silence that would follow. The weight of Sunday morning pressed down on her shoulders like the whole sky was falling, and she knew that no matter how many years passed, no matter how far she ran or how deep she buried this secret, she would always be the girl who chose love over honor, family over community, one life over many. The church doors closed with a sound like thunder, and Clara Santos began the longest wait of her life. The singing began at 10 o'clock, just like it had every Sunday for the past 20 years. Clara could hear it through the walls of her house, voices raised in harmony, trusting and pure, floating on the morning air like prayers made of sound. Amazing grace drifted across the dusty street, and Clara pressed her hands against her ears, but she could not shut out what was coming. Santos had fallen back asleep on the old sofa, his small body curled like a question mark, his breathing soft and even. Clara envied him that peace. She envied him the sleep that would keep him from seeing what she had done. Through her window, she could see the church clearly. The white wooden walls seemed to glow in the morning light, and the simple cross on the roof cast a shadow that fell across the cemetery where her mother lay buried. Inside those walls, 37 people sat in wooden pews, their heads bowed in prayer, their hearts full of Sunday morning faith. 37 people who would be dead before noon. The singing stopped, and Clara heard Father Miguel's voice begin the communion prayer. Even from this distance, she could hear the rhythm of the words she knew by heart. Words about sacrifice and love, about blood spilled for the forgiveness of sins. Her mother had taught her those words when she was small, making her repeat them until they lived in her bones like breath. Take, eat. This is my body, which is given for you. Clara's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor beside the window. Her hands shook so hard she had to clutch them together to make them still. In her mind, she could see Father Miguel lifting the silver cup, the same cup that had held communion wine for 3 generations of Sundays. The cup her grandfather had carried all the way from Mexico when the family first came to this valley. The cup that was now full of death. The first scream came 15 minutes later. It was high and sharp, cutting through the desert quiet like a knife. Clara's head snapped up, and she saw people beginning to stumble from the church. Not walking, but falling through the doors like broken dolls. Mrs. Henderson came first, her blue dress twisted around her legs, her face white as altar cloth. She made it 3 steps before she collapsed in the dust, her hands clutching at her throat. Then came the Parker boys, stumbling and crying, calling for their mother, who was somewhere behind them in the darkness of the church. Little Mary Parker tried to run to them, but she fell halfway across the churchyard, her yellow ribbon finally coming loose from her hair. Clara stood slowly, her legs shaking, her heart beating so fast it felt like it might tear itself apart. Through the church doors, she could see chaos, people falling over pews, hands reaching for help that would not come, voices raised not in him but in the terrible music of dying. But in the center of it all, Father Miguel stood perfectly still. He held the silver cup in his hands, and he was looking directly at her window. Even with the distance between them, even with the dust and the heat shimmer and the horror unfolding around him, Clara could see his eyes. They were not angry. They were not afraid. They were filled with a sadness so deep and old it seemed to have been there since the beginning of time. He knew. Somehow, he had always known. Old Mr. Chun crawled out of the church on his hands and knees, his Sunday suit torn and dirty, his wife's name on his lips like a prayer that would not be answered. The Gonzalez twins had stopped crying. Their mother held them against her chest, but they were all 3 perfectly still now, perfectly quiet, like a family of sleeping birds. The Rodriguez children lay scattered across the church steps like fallen leaves. 6 of them, all in a row like she had seen them walking just an hour before, but now their hair was no longer slicked down neat. Now, it was wild and matted with dust and the sweat of their final moments. Claire wanted to run to them. She wanted to gather them up and hold them and tell them she was sorry, so sorry, that she had never meant for this to happen. But her feet would not move. She stood frozen at her window like a statue made of guilt and grief, watching her world die one person at a time. Father Miguel was walking now, moving between the bodies with careful steps. He knelt beside Mrs. Henderson and closed her eyes with gentle fingers. He straightened little Mary Parker's yellow ribbon and folded her small hands across her chest. He moved like a man who had been preparing for this moment his whole life, like a shepherd counting his flock one final time. And still, the silver cup remained in his hand, untouched. The screaming had stopped now. The only sounds were the wind moving through the mesquite trees and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the valley. Redemption Creek had gone as quiet as a hell breath, as silent as a prayer that would never be answered. Clara stepped away from the window and picked up Santos, cradling his sleeping weight against her chest. She could not stay here. She could not watch Father Miguel walking among the dead, could not see the way he looked at her with those knowing, sorrowful eyes. She slipped out her back door and ran toward the hills, her bare feet pounding against the hard earth, her brother's weight heavy in her arms. Behind her, the church sat in the morning sun like a white tomb, its doors open to the desert wind. The church bells, which had rung every Sunday for 20 years, were finally silent. Clara ran until her legs gave out, until her lungs burned like fire, until she reached the old mine shaft halfway up Widow's Peak. She set Santos down in the shade and turned to look back at the town spread out below her. From this distance, Redemption Creek looked peaceful, just a collection of small buildings huddled around a white church, like a child's toy village left in the dust. But Clara knew better. She knew that in those small buildings, Sunday dinners would go cold on the table. She knew that in that white church, 37 people lay still and quiet, their Sunday clothes spread around them like flower petals, their faces turned toward heaven. 37 people who had trusted her. 37 people who had loved her. 37 people who were dead because she had chosen to save one. Santos stirred in his sleep and reached for her hand. His fingers were small and warm, alive with the pulse of blood and breath, and all the tomorrows she had bought him with other people's todays. She held his hand and watched smoke begin to rise from the chimneys of the empty town below. Sunday dinners that would burn to ash because no one was left to tend them. Father Miguel appeared in the churchyard, a small dark figure moving among the bodies. Even from this distance, Clara could see the silver cup still in his hands. He looked up toward the hills then, and Clara knew he was looking for her, knew he was waiting. The sun climbed higher, and the desert heat began to shimmer off the rocks around her. Santos slept on, peaceful and unaware, while Clara sat in the dust and counted the cost of her choice. 37 lives for one. 37 souls on her conscience for all the days she had left to live. Down in the valley, Father Miguel continued his vigil among the dead, and the church bells remained silent as stones. The town looked smaller when Clara came back. 3 days had passed since she ran to the hills. 3 days of watching smoke rise from chimneys that would never be tended again. 3 days of hearing Santos ask why they couldn't go home. Now she stood at the edge of Redemption Creek with her brother's sleeping weight against her shoulder, and the place that had been her whole world seemed no bigger than a child's scattered toys. The wind had been busy while she was gone. Dust had gathered in the corners of doorways and piled against the steps of houses where no one would ever climb them again. A tumbleweed had caught against Mrs. Henderson's front gate, and it rolled back and forth in the breeze like something restless, something that couldn't find peace. The church doors still stood open, just as they had been when the last person stumbled out to die. Clara could see the dark interior beyond, could see the wooden pews where families had sat together for the final time. She did not want to look closer. She did not want to see what remained. Instead, she walked toward the sound that had drawn her back, the steady rhythm of metal biting earth, the patient scrape of a shovel working against hard ground. The sound was coming from the cemetery behind the church, where wild roses bloomed in summer and her mother's headstone caught the morning light. Father Miguel was there, just as she had known he would be. He stood waist-deep in a grave, his black robes rolled up to his elbows, his gray hair dark with sweat. The shovel in his hands was worn smooth from use, and his movements had the slow, careful rhythm of a man who had been digging for days. Around him, the cemetery had grown. Where there had been 12 graves before, now there were rows upon rows of fresh earth, each mound marked with a simple wooden cross. 37 crosses, 37 graves, 37 reasons why Clara could never truly go home again. Father Miguel looked up when her shadow fell across the grave, and Clara saw that his hands were raw and bleeding. His face was thinner than she remembered, carved hollow by 3 days of grief and labor. But his eyes held the same patient sadness they had held when he watched her from the church steps, the same terrible understanding. "I've been waiting for you," he said quietly, and his voice was hoarse from prayers spoken over the dead. Clara shifted Santos to her other arm and felt her throat close around words that wanted to come, but couldn't find their way out. She had practiced this moment during the long nights in the hills, had rehearsed the confession that burned in her chest like swallowed fire. But now, standing in the shadow of all these graves, the words felt too small for what she had done. "Help me out of here, child," Father Miguel said, and Clara set Santos down in the shade of her mother's headstone before reaching down to pull the old priest from the grave. His hands were warm and solid in hers, and when he stood beside her, she could smell the earth on his clothes, the honest sweat of hard work done in sorrow. They stood together in the cemetery, surrounded by the dead, and Clara finally found her voice. "They're all dead because of me," she whispered. Father Miguel nodded slowly, as if she had told him something he had known since the beginning of time. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and began cleaning the dirt from his bleeding hands, his movements careful and deliberate. "I know," he said. "The outlaws came 3 nights ago," Clara continued, and the words began to pour out of her like water from a broken dam. "They said they would kill Santos if I didn't do it. They held a knife to his throat and made me choose. One life or many? My brother or my neighbors? I thought. Her voice broke, and she had to stop and breathe before she could continue. I thought I could save him. I thought one life was worth more than 37 if that one life was everything to me. Father Miguel listened without judgment, his weathered hands folding the dirty handkerchief with the same care he brought to folding altar cloths. When Clara finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the graves that stretched between them and the church. Love makes us do terrible things sometimes, he said finally. The heart doesn't count numbers, Clara. It doesn't weigh one soul against another. It only knows what it cannot bear to lose. But they trusted me, Clara said, and tears began to slide down her cheeks like rain on dry earth. Mrs. Henderson used to bring me soup when I was sick. The Parker children played in my yard every afternoon. Mr. Chun gave Santos candy when he thought I wasn't looking. They were good people, and I killed them all. Father Miguel reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a wooden cross, carved smooth and simple, no bigger than his palm. He turned it over in his hands as he spoke, his thumb tracing the worn edges. I made this for my sister when I was 12 years old, he said. She was dying of fever, and I thought if I could make something holy enough, God would spare her. I carved it from an old oak tree, spent weeks getting every line perfect. I prayed over it until my knees were raw from kneeling. He looked up at Clara, and his eyes held 40 years of understanding pain. She died anyway. Clara wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, listening. I was angry for years, Father Miguel continued. Angry at God, angry at myself, angry at the cross that had failed to save her. I threw it in a river and walked away from everything I believed. But you know what I learned, child? The cross wasn't meant to stop her from dying. It was meant to carry the love I felt for her. Love doesn't always save the people we want to save, but it saves something in us. It saves the part that remembers what it means to care more about someone else than about yourself. He held the wooden cross out to her, and Clara took it with shaking hands. The wood was warm and smooth, polished by decades of worry and prayer. What you did was born of love, he said gently. Terrible love, desperate love, but love nonetheless. The kind of love that would tear itself apart to save what it holds most dear. That kind of love doesn't make the choice right, but it makes the person who chose a human. Clara clutched the cross against her chest and felt something break open inside her. Not breaking apart, but breaking open the way a seed breaks open to let life through. How do I live with it? She whispered. How do I wake up every morning knowing what I've done? Father Miguel looked around at the graves, at the empty town, at Santos sleeping peaceful and innocent in the shade. The same way I lived with watching my sister die. The same way anyone lives with carrying love that's bigger than they are. You remember them. You honor what they meant to you. You let the guilt teach you how precious life is, but you don't let it convince you that your life isn't precious too. The sun was beginning to set, painting the desert hills the color of old blood. Santos stirred in his sleep and reached for Clara without opening his eyes, his small hand finding hers with the instinct of someone who had never doubted that she would be there. Father Miguel began walking toward the church, his steps slow and measured. Come, he said, help me clean this sanctuary. Tomorrow we'll hold a service for the dead, and then we'll decide what comes next. Clara followed him toward the white building that had been the heart of her world, the wooden cross warm in her palm, her brother's hand small and trusting in hers. Behind them, 37 graves caught the last light of day, and the wind whispered through the wild roses like a prayer for the living and the dead. As they walked, Clara realized that confession had not made the weight disappear. It had simply taught her how to carry it, how to walk forward with the knowledge of what love could cost and what it was worth. The ruins of Redemption Creek spread around them, but in the failing light, she could almost see the possibility of something new growing from the ashes of what was lost. The first frost came early that year, touching the wild roses in the cemetery with silver fingers and turning the desert grass the color of old parchment. Clara stood beside the last grave they had dug, watching Father Miguel speak words over Thomas Chun, the youngest of Old Mister. Chin's grandsons. The boy had been only 15, with dreams of becoming a blacksmith and hands that were gentle with horses. 37 graves now filled the space behind the church, 37 wooden crosses marking the end of the world Clara had known. The work had taken them 2 weeks of digging in the hard earth and speaking prayers over people who had been neighbors, friends, family in all the ways that mattered. Father Miguel's hands had healed during those days, growing new calluses over the old ones, and Clara had learned to swing a shovel with the steady rhythm of grief made useful. Santos played among the headstones while they worked, too young to understand the weight of what surrounded him, but old enough to know he should be quiet in this place. He made small horses from twigs and stones, racing them between the graves in whispered games that seemed appropriate to the silence that had settled over Redemption Creek like dust. "It's finished," Father Miguel said, setting down his shovel and pulling his handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the sweat from his forehead. His voice was heavy with more than just the work they had done. It was heavy with the knowledge that they had buried not just bodies, but a way of life, a community, a world that would never come again. Clara looked out over the cemetery and felt the weight of every name carved into every cross. Mrs. Henderson, who had taught her to sew. The Parker children, who had filled summer afternoons with laughter. The Rodriguez family, who had always had room at their table for one more. All gone because of a choice she had made in darkness and terror, trying to save the one life that mattered most to her. "I should leave," she said quietly. "I should take Santos and go west or south, somewhere they've never heard of Redemption Creek or Clara Santos. Somewhere I can pretend to be someone else." Father Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving across the graves with the careful attention of a man counting something precious. Then he turned and began walking toward the back of the church, his steps slow and deliberate. "Come with me," he said. "There's something you need to see." Clara called Santos to her and followed the old priest around the white wooden building to the small yard behind the sanctuary. She had not been back here since the Sunday morning that changed everything, as she braced herself for whatever memory waited in this forgotten corner of her childhood. But what she saw was not a memory. It was a miracle. A small apple tree stood against the church's back wall, its branches heavy with red fruit that caught the autumn light like jewels. The tree was no taller than Clara's shoulder, young and slender, but strong in the way of things that grow in hard places. At its base, she could see the careful circle of stones that the children had placed there, the small signs of tending and care that spoke of young hands and hopeful hearts. "The Parker children planted it," Father Miguel said softly, 3 weeks before they died. Little Mary had saved the seeds from an apple her grandmother brought from back east. She wanted to plant something that would grow tall enough for her children to climb someday. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could see it so clearly, Mary's small hands digging in the earth, her brothers helping to carry water, all of them laughing and planning for a future they would never see. The tree they had planted with such hope now stood alone, bearing fruit in a world without them. "I've been watering it," Father Miguel continued. "Seemed wrong to let it die when it had grown so well despite everything. Life finds a way, Clara. Even here, even now, life finds a way." Clara reached out and touched one of the red apples, feeling its smooth skin warm from the sun. It was perfect, untouched by the tragedy that had consumed everything else in this place. A gift from children who had trusted in tomorrow, even when tomorrow had not come for them. "You have a choice," Father Miguel said, his voice gentle but firm. "You can run from what you've done, carry your guilt to some distant place where no one knows your name. You can spend the rest of your life being Clara the stranger, Clara the woman with the mysterious sadness, Clara who talks to no one and trusts nothing and lets her heart turn to dust." He moved to stand beside the apple tree, his weathered hand resting against its slender trunk. "Or you can stay. You can tend to what remains. You can water this tree and keep the cemetery neat and be here when travelers come through, asking about the town that used to be. You can be the keeper of their memory, the guardian of their stories, the one who makes sure they are not forgotten." Clara looked at Santos, who was examining the fallen apples with the serious attention of a 7-year-old scientist. His dark hair caught the light the same way her mother's had, and in his profile, she could see the shape of the man he would become. If she could find the strength to raise him, if she could learn to live with what she had done. "It won't bring them back," she said. "No," Father Miguel agreed. "Nothing will bring them back. But staying won't take them away either. Running will. Running will turn them into ghosts that follow you everywhere, whispers at the edge of your hearing, shadows that grow longer with every mile you put between yourself and this place. Stay, and they become something else. They become the reason you get up in the morning, the hands that guide you when you don't know what to do, the voices that remind you why life is precious." Clara closed her eyes and felt the weight of the choice settling on her shoulders like a familiar coat. She thought of highways stretching west toward unknown horizons, of new names and new faces and the possibility of pretending that Clara Santos had never existed. She thought of escape. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the apple tree, heavy with fruit that would feed no one if she left, growing strong in earth that held the bones of everyone she had ever loved. "I'll stay," she whispered. The seasons turned. Winter came with snow that covered the graves like forgiveness, soft and white and clean. Spring brought wildflowers that grew between the headstones, and Clara learned their names from a book Father Miguel had carried from his childhood. Summer brought travelers, merchants, and families moving west, cowboys driving cattle north. And Clara learned to tell the story of Redemption Creek without telling all of it, to speak of the community that had been without speaking of how it ended. Slowly, carefully, new people began to settle in the valley. A family from Kansas who heard there was good water and empty land. A widow with 3 children who needed a place to start over. A young blacksmith who saw opportunity in a town that needed rebuilding. They came with their own stories, their own losses, their own hopes for tomorrow. Clara helped them build new houses on the foundations of old ones. She showed them where the good water ran and which wild plants were safe to eat. She watched their children play in the dust where other children had once played, and if sometimes her heart caught when she heard their laughter, she learned to let it be a reminder rather than a wound. The apple tree grew taller each year. By the time Santos turned 12, it was tall enough to climb, its branches strong enough to hold the weight of children who had never known the world that came before. Clara built a small schoolhouse beside the church, and when the new families asked her to teach their children, she said yes. She taught them letters and numbers under the shade of Mary Parker's tree. She taught them about kindness and hard work and the importance of taking care of each other. She never spoke of that Sunday morning, never told them why the cemetery held so many graves from the same year, never explained the sadness that lived behind her eyes like a careful flame. But the children seemed to understand that their teacher carried something heavy, something that made her voice gentle when she corrected them and made her hands careful when she bandaged their scraped knees. They brought her wildflowers from the hills and drawings made with charcoal and water, and Clara kept every gift in a wooden box beside her bed. Years passed, and Santos grew into a young man with his father's strong hands and his mother's gentle heart. He married Emma Rodriguez, the daughter of one of the new families, and they built a house on the far side of town where the wind carried the scent of sage and possibility. Clara became a grandmother, then a grandmother twice over, and she taught Santos's children the same lesson she had taught their father: how to read the sky for weather, how to coax vegetables from stubborn soil, how to measure kindness not in words but in actions. The apple tree grew tall and strong, its branches spreading wide enough to shelter a dozen children at once. Each fall it bore fruit that fed the whole town, and each spring Clara stood beneath its blossoms and remembered the children who had planted it with such hope, such faith in the future they would never see. She was 53 when a stranger came to town, a man with silver hair and a badge that caught the light. He had heard stories, he said, about a place called Redemption Creek, about a Sunday morning when everyone died and only a priest and a girl survived. He had questions about outlaws, about poison, about justice that had never come. Clara met him in the cemetery, among the graves she had tended for 26 years. She told him the truth, all of it, without shame or excuse or plea for understanding. She told him about the knife at her brother's throat and the choice that had broken her world in two. She told him about love and terror and the weight of 37 lives on one girl's conscience. The man listened without judgment, taking notes in a small leather book. When she finished, he closed the book and looked out over the town that had grown from the ashes of tragedy. "The outlaws are all dead," he said finally. "Killed each other over gold in Colorado 5 years back. There's no justice left to serve, no trial to be held. Just you, living with what you've done." "I know," Clara said. He tipped his hat and rode away, and Clara never saw him again. But his visit had given her something she had not expected, a kind of closure, a sense that the story had finally been told complete. That evening, she sat under the apple tree with her grandchildren, watching them play in the golden light of autumn. The youngest, a girl of 4 with Santos's dark eyes, climbed into Clara's lap and asked why she always looked so sad when she watched them play. Clara smoothed the child's hair and felt the weight of years settle around her like a familiar shawl. "Because I'm remembering other children," she said gently. "Children who planted this tree and never got to see it grow tall." The girl considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important things. "Do you think they can see it now?" she asked. Clara looked up through the branches at the darkening sky, where stars were beginning to show themselves like small promises of light in darkness. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in 26 years, she believed it completely. "I think they can see it just fine." The apple tree rustled in the evening breeze, heavy with fruit and memory and the patient hope of seeds planted in faith, growing strong in the ashes of what was lost, reaching always toward the light.